Watch his face change. Watch it change the second she opened her mouth. Because Sheikh Khalid bin Rashid Al-Fahim had just ordered his entire dinner in Arabic, on purpose, to make a point in front of his guests. He wanted the waitress to stand there confused. He wanted to laugh at her. What he did not expect, what nobody in that restaurant expected, was for her to answer him back in a dialect so old that even his own translator had never heard it spoken by a living person. The room went silent. His glass stopped halfway to his mouth. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Khalid bin Rashid did not know what to say. Because the words she used did not belong to this century. They belonged to his grandfather's grandfather. They belonged to a desert that no longer exists on modern maps. And somehow, this woman in a plain black uniform, refilling water glasses for minimum wage, spoke them like they were her mother tongue. He would spend the rest of that night trying to work out who she really was. He had no idea that by the end of the week, that question would unravel a secret his own family had buried for 90 years. But to understand what happened at that table, you first have to understand the kind of man Khalid bin Rashid had become, and the kind of woman he thought he was looking at. Khalid was 38 years old, and he had inherited more money than most countries collect in a year. His family's name sat on the side of towers in 3 cities. He flew in a private jet with his own crest painted on the tail. He had never once in his adult life waited in a line, carried his own bag, or been told the word no. That night, he was hosting 2 European investors at the most expensive restaurant in the city, a glass-walled place 40 floors above the street, the kind of restaurant where the menu doesn't list prices because if you have to ask, you don't belong there. He wanted to impress them. He wanted them to see exactly how much power a man like him could casually hold in one hand. So when the waitress approached the table, young, quiet, hair pulled back tight, name tag reading only Layla, Khalid decided to have some fun. He looked at his investors, smiled the smile of a man about to perform a trick, and switched from English into rapid, formal Arabic, ordering 7 courses without once looking up at her. He wasn't ordering food. Not really. He was drawing a line. A line that said, you clean tables, I own towers, and there is an entire world of language and meaning happening above your head that you will never be part of. His investors chuckled, not because they understood a word of it, but because they understood exactly what he was doing. Power doesn't need translation. Cruelty is its own language. Layla stood there for a moment. She did not flush red. She did not stammer. She simply tilted her head slightly, the way someone does when they're deciding whether to let something go. And then she answered him. Not in English. Not in modern Arabic either. She answered him in a dialect so old that the words themselves seemed to come from underground, from something buried and dry and half forgotten. Consonants shaped differently. Vowels stretched in a way no living newsreader or teacher used anymore. A rhythm that belonged to poetry recited around fires, not text messages. Khalid's smile did not fall all at once. It cracked slowly, like ice under weight. His translator, a stiff, meticulous man named Faisal who had degrees in classical Arabic linguistics, actually stood halfway up out of his chair. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Because he recognized maybe 1 word in 5. And the words he did recognize terrified him more than the ones he didn't. She had used the old formal address, the one reserved centuries ago for tribal elders and judges. She had used it toward Khalid. Not as flattery. As irony so precise it was almost a blade. Remember that detail. The dialect she used wasn't just old. It was specific to one family line, one region, one order of desert scribes that history books list as extinct. You'll want to remember that, because it becomes the whole reason this story exists. Khalid set down his fork. Where, he asked slowly, switching back to modern Arabic, did you learn to speak like that? Layla looked at him for a long moment, something calm, almost sad, behind her eyes. My grandfather taught me, she said simply, in perfectly normal, contemporary Arabic now, as if she'd flipped a switch closing a door behind her. Will there be anything else, sir? She refilled his water and walked away, leaving 3 of the most powerful men in the room staring at each other in silence. Have you ever tried to humiliate someone, only to discover you were the one standing exposed? To understand who Layla really was, you need to go back 22 years, to a small stone house on the edge of a desert town most maps don't bother naming, a place where the electricity came and went like a guest who couldn't decide if it wanted to stay. There lived an old man named Saeed, and Saeed carried something in his memory that no university, no library, and no government archive had managed to preserve. He carried an entire language. Not a slang. Not a regional accent. A full, structured dialect, the last living fragment of a scribal order that once served desert courts long before oil, long before borders, long before any of the— They will forget the small kingdoms, his grandfather told him. They will remember the great families and the great oil fields. But someone has to remember the words. Someone has to remember what was said, and to whom, and why. Otherwise the truth becomes whatever the winners decide to write. Saeed never became rich. He never became famous. He worked as a shepherd, then a mechanic, then finally as a night watchman at a small regional archive that nobody visited. But every single night, he took his granddaughter Layla onto the roof of their small stone house, and under a sky thick with stars no city light ever reached, he taught her the old tongue, word by word, the way his grandfather had taught him. She used to complain it was pointless. Nobody speaks this anymore, Jiddo. Why do I need to learn a language for ghosts? And Saeed would only smile and say the same thing every time. One day, baby girl, this language is going to matter more than money. And when that day comes, you'll be the only one in the room who understands what's actually being said. Hold on to that. Because that day was closer than either of them knew. Layla's family had little money. Her mother cleaned houses in the city. Her father had died young, working construction on a tower he would never have been allowed inside once it was finished. Layla grew up watching wealthy families build glass palaces on land that used to belong to people like her grandfather's people. Families erased so thoroughly that even their names had become footnotes. She moved to the city at 19 to help support her mother and grandfather, taking whatever work she could find. Waitressing paid better than most jobs open to her, and the restaurant she eventually landed in happened to be the tallest, most expensive one in the city, the exact kind of place where old money came to remind itself how powerful it still was. She never told anyone at work about the dialect. Why would she? It wasn't useful there. It wasn't useful anywhere, as far as she could tell. It was just a private thread connecting her to a grandfather she loved and a language that belonged to no one else alive. Until the night a wealthy man tried to embarrass her in a tongue he assumed she couldn't understand, and accidentally spoke directly into the one crack in his own family's history that had been sealed shut for 90 years. Because here is the detail that changes everything. The specific archaic terms Khalid used that night, the exact formal phrasing his family still trained its children to use for ceremonial orders, the very words he chose to make himself sound untouchably regal in front of his investors, were phrases that had originally belonged to that small forgotten emirate Saeed's grandfather once served. Khalid's family hadn't invented that regal language. They had taken it. 90 years ago, when the larger, wealthier Al-Fahim family absorbed the smaller emirate's territory, they didn't just take the land and the oil rights buried beneath it. They took the language of power that came with it, the ceremonial phrases, the formal court Arabic, all of it lifted wholesale and rebranded as their own ancient family tradition, taught to every Al-Fahim child for generations as proof of their timeless nobility. Except it wasn't their tradition. It was borrowed. Or, depending on who you ask, it was stolen. And the only people left alive who knew the difference were an old night watchman and his granddaughter. You see it now, don't you? The trap Khalid walked into wasn't set by anyone. He built it himself, one arrogant sentence at a time. The moment he opened his mouth in a language he believed no one beneath him could possibly understand. The next morning, Khalid could not stop thinking about it. He cancelled 2 meetings. He sat in his office 40 floors above the city and stared at nothing, replaying the sound of her voice in his head. He called Faisal, his translator, into his office. Tell me what she said. Exactly. Faisal looked uncomfortable. Sir, I only caught fragments. But the structure, the vocabulary. Sir, that dialect is supposed to be extinct. It's referenced in exactly 3 academic papers, all of them theoretical, all of them assuming no living speakers remain. I did my doctoral thesis partially on regional dialectal decline, and I have never heard anyone actually speak it. Not once. Not even recordings. Then how does a waitress speak it fluently? Faisal hesitated. And here is where the story takes its first real turn, because Faisal, quiet, careful Faisal, said something that made Khalid go very still. Sir, there's another possibility. That dialect isn't just old. It's specifically associated with the court of the old Al-Zahrani emirate, the one your great-grandfather's family absorbed in the 1930s. Khalid's jaw tightened. I know my family history, Faisal. With respect, sir, I'm not sure you do. Not all of it. That single sentence would not leave Khalid alone for the rest of the day. Because the truth is, Khalid's family history, the version he'd been raised on, was full of convenient gaps. He knew his great-grandfather had unified several smaller territories in the early 20th century. He knew the family fortune had grown enormously during that period. What he had never been told, what nobody in his family had ever told him, was exactly how that unification happened, or what had been done to the people who used to run the smaller courts his family absorbed. He decided to find out. And the only lead he had was a young waitress with an old man's language living somewhere in his mouth. He went back to the restaurant that same evening, alone this time, no investors, no audience. He asked for her by name. The manager, nervous and eager to please a man whose family practically owned the building, told him Layla had already left for the day, but that she'd be back tomorrow at 5. Khalid almost turned around and walked away. A part of him, the old part, the part raised to believe that people beneath him existed to serve, not to be chased, told him this was beneath his dignity. But another part of him, a part he didn't recognize yet, the part that had gone quiet and cold the second she'd spoken, told him he needed to know the truth more than he needed his pride. So he waited. When Layla arrived the next afternoon, she found the Sheikh sitting alone at a corner table, nursing coffee he clearly hadn't ordered to drink. She stopped a few feet away, wary, the way anyone learns to be wary around powerful men who suddenly want something from them. Sir, she said carefully, is there a problem with your service yesterday? No, Khalid said. There's a problem with my history. And I think you might be the only person left alive who can help me understand it. She said nothing. She simply waited, the same calm patience her grandfather had spent a lifetime teaching her. That dialect, Khalid continued. Where exactly did your grandfather learn it? And here Layla made a decision that would change both their lives. She could have lied. She could have said it was nothing, a game, a family joke, and walked away back into the safety of being invisible. Her grandfather had warned her, more than once, never to speak of their family's history around powerful men, because powerful men had a habit of either stealing what they found valuable or burying it so no one else could have it either. But something about the way Khalid asked the question, quiet, almost afraid of the answer, told her this wasn't a trap. This was a man standing at the edge of a truth he couldn't quite see yet, and some part of her, the part shaped by a grandfather who believed the words mattered more than the silence, decided he deserved to see it. My grandfather's grandfather, she said slowly, served as court translator and royal scribe for an emirate that no longer exists. It was called Al-Zahrani. Perhaps you've heard the name in an old textbook footnote, if you're lucky enough to have found one that still mentions it. Khalid felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him. That emirate, Layla continued, watching his face carefully now, was absorbed, very quietly, very completely, by a larger, wealthier family in the 1930s. The official history says it was a peaceful unification. My grandfather's grandfather told a very different story, one passed down at bedtime instead of in any book, about how that peaceful unification actually happened. Tell me, Khalid said. Layla glanced around the restaurant, then sat down across from him without being invited, an act that would have been unthinkable a week earlier and now felt like the most natural thing in the world. The Al-Zahrani emirate wasn't large, she said, but it controlled something valuable, a set of natural springs and a strategic mountain pass that every larger family in the region wanted access to. When your family's ancestors came to negotiate, They came with soldiers, not just diplomats. The Emirates' ruling family was given a choice. Sign over control quietly, in exchange for money and protection, or watch their small kingdom be taken by force and erased from every future map. They signed, Khalid said quietly. They signed, Layla agreed. But the ruler of Al-Zahrani was a proud man, and before he handed over his lands, he made one demand your great-grandfather agreed to without understanding what it truly meant. He asked that the ceremonial language of his court, the formal words used for judgment, for blessing, for command, be preserved and used by the family who absorbed his kingdom, as a kind of hidden tribute to what had been lost. Your great-grandfather agreed instantly. He probably thought it sounded impressive. Ancient, regal, untouchable. He had no idea he was inheriting a curse disguised as a compliment. A curse. A promise, Layla corrected softly. The old ruler's dying wish was that as long as his language was still spoken by his people's descendants, his family's story could never fully be erased. He didn't fight your family with weapons. He fought them with memory. And he made sure someone would still be alive to translate that memory back, exactly at the moment it was needed most. Khalid sat back slowly, his coffee forgotten, his powerful, untouchable world suddenly feeling very small. You're telling me, he said, that everything my family has used for 90 years to prove how ancient and noble we are, belongs to your family. I'm telling you, Layla said, that language was never a gift. It was a loan. And loans come due. Now here's where you might think the story turns to blackmail, to lawsuits, to a woman finally taking revenge on the family that erased hers. That's what a lesser story would do. That's what Khalid himself half expected, bracing for a demand, a threat, a price tag attached to her silence. But Layla wasn't her grandfather's granddaughter for nothing. I don't want your money, she said, watching the assumption cross his face and calmly cutting it down before it could grow. I don't want a settlement. I don't want an apology printed in a newspaper nobody reads. I want something much smaller and much harder for a man like you to give. What? The truth. Written down properly, this time. Not buried in your family archive with a paperweight on it. I want the real history of Al-Zahrani preserved, publicly, correctly, with my grandfather's family credited as the last keepers of that language. Not for money. For memory. Because the entire reason my grandfather spent his whole life teaching me those words on a rooftop, when nobody else on earth thought they mattered, was so that someday, someone in your family's position would have to sit across from someone in mine, and finally hear it said plainly. Khalid was quiet for a long moment. Why didn't your grandfather ever come forward himself? Why let this stay a secret for 90 years? And here is a detail that will sit with you long after this video ends. Because, Layla said, the first time his own grandfather tried, quietly, respectfully, to remind your family what that language actually was and where it came from, he disappeared for 3 weeks. When he came back, he never spoke of it again. And he made every descendant after him promise never to bring it up directly to anyone with power. Only to teach it. Only to wait. My grandfather always believed that the truth doesn't need to be shouted to survive. It only needs one person left who refuses to forget it. Khalid's hands were shaking slightly now, and it had nothing to do with the coffee. Because if what she was saying was true, and something in his gut told him it absolutely was, then his own family's founding legend, the one drilled into every Al-Fahim child from birth, the story of noble unification and ancient unbroken heritage, was built on a threat and a silencing that had lasted almost a century. He asked her to give him 3 days. She agreed, though not without warning him plainly. 3 days is generous, Sheikh Khalid. My grandfather waited his entire life for one conversation. Don't mistake my patience for weakness. It never was. Those 3 days would turn out to be the longest of Khalid's life, because what he found when he finally went looking through his own family's private archive was far worse than even Layla had described. He found ledgers. Old, brittle, deliberately hidden ledgers, locked in a section of the family vault his father had told him, years earlier, contained nothing but outdated property deeds. Instead, Khalid found detailed records of the Al-Zahrani unification, written not for public history, but for the family's own private accounting. Payments made to the Al-Zahrani ruling family in exchange for their silence about how the negotiation truly happened. A private letter, in his own great-grandfather's handwriting, casually referring to the small emirate soldiers as an inconvenience easily resolved. A separate note, chillingly clinical, documenting the removal of the previous court scribe when he attempted, decades later, to speak publicly about what had been taken. Removal. Not by name, not by detail, just the word itself, sitting on a page like a stone. Khalid sat alone in that vault for hours, the air conditioning humming, the weight of his entire family's public identity slowly crumbling in his hands. Everything he had been taught to be proud of, the ceremonial phrases his father had insisted he memorize as a child, the formal court Arabic used at every family wedding and funeral to prove their ancient unbroken lineage, all of it had been lifted from a family his own ancestors had erased and then silenced by force. And the only reason any of it had survived long enough to be recognized, the only reason his own arrogant attempt to humiliate a waitress had backfired so completely, was because one old night watchman had spent a lifetime keeping a promise on a rooftop under the stars, teaching his granddaughter words he was warned never to speak aloud himself. Do you see it now? The cruelty Khalid tried to perform in that restaurant wasn't just embarrassing. It was, without him ever realizing it, an echo of the exact same cruelty his family had committed almost a century earlier. A powerful man speaking a language of dominance at someone he assumed couldn't answer back. History doesn't always repeat by coincidence. Sometimes it repeats because nobody ever stopped to ask where the words actually came from. On the third day, Khalid did not summon Layla to his office. He went to hers, if you could call a restaurant break room an office, still in his suit, unannounced, carrying a single folder under his arm. She looked up from tying her apron, surprised, then carefully unreadable, the way her grandfather had taught her to be around powerful men until she understood exactly what they wanted. I read everything, Khalid said. All of it. What my family did to yours wasn't unification. It was theft, backed by force, and then silenced by threats when someone tried to tell the truth about it. Layla said nothing. She simply waited, the same patience, the same stillness, giving him room to finish what he'd clearly been rehearsing. I can't undo 90 years, Khalid continued. I know that. But I can stop pretending it didn't happen. My family has a cultural foundation. It funds museum exhibits, historical preservation projects, language documentation efforts, all curated, of course, to make us look generous and enlightened. I'm going to use it properly for the first time. There will be a full public exhibit on the Al-Zahrani Emirate, its true history, its language, and your family's role in preserving what mine tried to erase. Your grandfather's name goes on it, not mine. And if I say that's not enough, then it's not enough, Khalid said simply. And I'll ask you what would be. Because I don't think you're the kind of person who wants revenge, Layla. I think you're the kind of person who wants to be believed. I believe you. Publicly. Permanently. That's what I can actually offer. For the first time since that night at the table, Layla allowed herself something close to a smile, small, guarded, but real. My grandfather always said the truth doesn't need to be shouted to survive, she said quietly. But he also said it deserves to finally be heard out loud, at least once, by someone who has the power to make sure it's never buried again. 3 weeks later, in a private quiet ceremony that made no headlines and drew no cameras, because Layla had specifically asked for exactly that, Khalid personally invited Saeed, the old night watchman, into a restored section of his family's archive. The old man walked slowly through rooms filled with recovered documents, restored court records, and a small glass case containing hand-copied fragments of the old Al-Zahrani ceremonial language, transcribed at last, properly, correctly, credited. Saeed stopped in front of that case for a long time. Khalid stood beside him, saying nothing, letting the old man have the moment his own grandfather had waited a lifetime for and never received. You know, Saeed finally said, his voice thin with age but steady, my grandfather used to tell me that words are the only thing powerful families can never fully steal, because the moment they try to use them without understanding them, the words start working against the thief instead of for him. Khalid nodded slowly. I understand that now. Better than I'd like to admit. Good, Saeed said. Because understanding is the only apology that ever actually means anything. Layla stood a few steps behind them, watching her grandfather finally see, in his final years, the thing he had spent his entire life quietly protecting come back into the light. Not as a weapon, not as a payday, but as the truth, spoken plainly, and finally believed. She never quit her job at the restaurant, though people ask her about it sometimes. She says it reminds her of exactly where she came from, and exactly what one quiet conversation can undo, given enough patience and the right words spoken at the right moment. Khalid changed too, though slowly, the way real change usually happens, not overnight, not perfectly, but visibly. He started asking questions about his family's history instead of simply repeating it. He started listening in rooms where he used to only perform. And every time he uses the old ceremonial Arabic now, at a wedding, at a formal gathering, he tells the true story behind it first, unprompted, the way his great-grandfather never once had the courage to do. So here's what I want you to take from Khalid and Layla's story tonight. The words you inherit, the traditions you were handed without question, the history you were taught to be proud of, none of it is fully yours until you understand where it actually came from and who it actually belonged to first. Never assume the quiet person across the table doesn't understand exactly what you're saying. Sometimes they understand it better than you ever will, because they're the one who was forced to remember it, while you were only ever taught to repeat it. If Layla and Saeed's story moved you tonight, let them know it mattered. Hit that like button so more people hear this one. Subscribe if you believe the truth is worth waiting a lifetime for. And drop one word in the comments, Al-Zahrani, if you promise to never underestimate the quiet ones again. I'll see you in the next story. Until then, listen closely. Some of the oldest words in the world are still waiting for someone to finally answer back.